Welcome to the channel. Before we step into the mud and the chaos of upstate New York in the summer of 1969, I have a small request. If you believe that rock and roll was at its best when it was dangerous, unpredictable, and impossible to control, then you are in the right place. We are building a community here for those who remember the feedback, the analog warmth, and the legends who walked among us. So, please, take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It helps us keep these stories alive against the algorithm, just like Jimmy fought against the machine. Now, let's head to Max Yaska's farm. The sun is rising, and history is about to be made. It was 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. August 18, 1969. The Aquarian Exposition was technically over. The dream of Woodstock, which had started 3 days earlier as a celebration of peace, love, and music, had devolved into a humanitarian disaster zone. Max Yaska's dairy farm in Bethel, New York, looked less like a concert venue and more like the aftermath of a medieval battle. The field was a churned sea of brown sludge, littered with discarded sleeping bags, empty cans, and the debris of 500,000 souls. The air smelled of wet earth, marijuana smoke, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, metallic tang of ozone. Most of the 500,000 attendees had already fled, defeated by the rain and the exhaustion. They were clogging the highways back to New York City, leaving behind a skeleton crew of roughly 40,000 diehards. These were the survivors. They were huddled in blankets, shivering in the damp morning mist, staring blankly at the massive wooden stage that loomed like a fortress at the bottom of the hill. They were tired, hungry, and coming down from a 3-day psychedelic odyssey. They weren't waiting for a show, they were waiting for a savior. They needed something to validate the suffering, something to make sense of the chaos. Backstage, the atmosphere was fraught with a different kind of tension. Jimi Hendrix, the highest-paid act of the festival, had been scheduled to close the show on Sunday night. But the chaotic logistics and the relentless storms had pushed his slot further and further back. He had been awake for nearly 3 days. He was a creature of the night, accustomed to the dark, smoky clubs and the midnight hour. Sunlight was his enemy. Yet here he was, blinking in the pale gray light of a humid August morning, watching the sun crest over the Catskill Mountains. Jimmy was not alone, but he was isolated. He had dissolved the original Jimi Hendrix experience, the tight, explosive power trio that had conquered the world, and replaced them with a sprawling, experimental ensemble he called Gypsy Sun and Rainbows. It was a ragtag group, his old army buddy Billy Cox on bass, Mitch Mitchell still on drums, but now augmented by a second guitarist, Larry Lee, and 2 percussionists, Juma Sultan and Jerry Velez. They were under-rehearsed. They had spent weeks jamming in a house in Shokin, New York, but they had never played a gig of this magnitude. The mood in the holding tent was fragile. The percussionists were nervous. Larry Lee, fresh out of the army and holding a guitar he barely knew how to tune properly, looked terrified. Jimmy, dressed in a white fringed leather jacket, blue jeans, and a red headband, paced like a caged panther. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just another gig, this was the defining cultural event of the generation, and he was the punctuation mark. If he failed here, in the cold light of day, the myth would shatter. "Is the sound ready?" he asked his roadie, Jerry Stickles. "As ready as it's gonna get, boss," Stickles replied. The Marshall stacks, 3 towering walls of them, were soaked with humidity. The pedals were caked in mud. The cables were a tangled nightmare. Jimmy picked up his weapon of choice for the morning, a white 1968 Fender Stratocaster. He called it Isabella. He plugged it into a complex chain of effects, a Vox wah pedal, a Dallas Arbiter fuzz face, and the most crucial element of his Woodstock tone, the Shinya Univibe. This device, designed to simulate the rotating speaker of a Hammond organ, gave his guitar a watery, swirling, underwater quality. It was the sound of a dream state. At 8:30 a.m., the announcer Chip Monk walked onto the stage. His voice, hoarse from 3 days of announcements, crackled over the massive speaker towers. Ladies and gentlemen, the Jimi Hendrix experience. Jimi stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the sea of mud and the tired faces. He smiled, a shy, almost apologetic smile. "I see that we meet again," he said softly, his voice echoing off the hills. "Dig. I hear you've been having a lot of hassles here, but we're gonna try to do our best." He didn't launch into a hit. He didn't start with Purple Haze. He started with a jam. A loose, sprawling improvisation that sounded like an engine trying to turn over on a cold morning. The band was shaky. The percussionists were out of time. Larry Lee was lost. For a terrifying few minutes, it looked like the whole thing was going to collapse. The Gypsy Sun and Rainbows sounded less like a band and more like a train wreck. But then, Jimi stepped on the fuzz face. The sound that erupted from the amplifiers was not music, it was geology. It was a thick, tectonic rumble that shook the mud from the stage floor. Jimi closed his eyes. He realized instantly that the band couldn't keep up with him. He had to carry them. He had to be the rhythm, the lead, the melody, and the noise all at once. He transitioned into, "Hear my train a-comin'." The Stratocaster screamed. The tone was biting, aggressive, yet possessed of a strange, liquid beauty thanks to the uni-vibe. He was wrestling the guitar, bending the neck, coaxing sustain that lasted for impossible seconds. The audience, half asleep moments before, began to stir. Heads lifted from blankets. Eyes opened. The energy in the valley shifted. They realized they weren't watching a concert, they were witnessing a resurrection. The sun broke through the clouds just as Jimi hit a high E note that pierced the morning air like a laser. The survivor's guilt of the crowd evaporated. They were the chosen ones. They had stayed. And now, the reward was beginning. As the set progressed, a strange dynamic began to unfold on the wooden planks of the Woodstock stage. Jimi had assembled this large band, Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, with the intention of creating a communal, rhythmic tapestry, a sky church music that blended rock, jazz, and soul. But as the morning wore on, it became painfully obvious that the concept was failing. The second guitarist, Larry Lee, struggled to stay in tune. The two percussionists, Juma Sultan and Jerry Valles, were chopping away at rhythms that clashed with Mitch Mitchell's fluid, jazz-inflected drumming. The sound was muddy, cluttered, and earthbound. Jimi, standing center stage, realized he was dragging an anchor. You can see it in the footage. There are moments of visible frustration where he turns to the band, signaling them to bring the volume down, to find the pocket, or simply to stop. But when the frustration peaked, Jimi didn't walk off. He didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, he did something that defines the difference between a musician and a virtuoso. He transcended the limitations of his environment by simply playing more. He began to play louder, harder, and more complex lines, effectively drowning out his own band. He turned the isolation into a weapon. By the time they launched into Voodoo Child, Slight Return, the other musicians had largely faded into the background noise. It was no longer an ensemble piece, it was a duel between a man and electricity. Jimi stomped on the wah pedal, and the guitar began to talk. It snarled, it laughed, it cried. The audience, now fully awake and standing in the mud, was locked in. They were witnessing a man shedding his skin in real time. The prompt you mentioned, the improvisation at the end, actually began to bleed into the entire set. Jimi was bored with the structures. He started stretching the songs, pulling them apart like taffy. In Spanish Castle Magic, there were no verses or choruses anymore, only waves of intensity. He was searching for something, a sound, a feeling, a frequency that could articulate the exhaustion and the ecstasy of the last 3 days. The guitar tone he achieved that morning is the holy grail for tone chasers. It wasn't just loud, it was three-dimensional. The Univibe pedal gave the notes a swirling, aquatic texture, like sound waves moving through heavy water. The fuzz face added a layer of grit that sounded like tearing Velcro. But it was his control of feedback that was truly supernatural. Most guitarists treated feedback as a mistake, a screech to be avoided. Jimi treated it as an instrument. He would lean his body against the amplifiers, finding the physical sweet spot where the sound loop would sustain indefinitely. He conducted the noise with his hands, waving them in the air, bending the pitch with his body weight. He wasn't playing the guitar, he was playing the amp, the air, and the electricity itself. And then, it happened. The moment that would separate Woodstock from every other concert in history. The band fell into a loose, jamming groove. Jimi signaled them to drop out. One by one, they stopped playing. The drums faded. The bass went silent. Larry Lee stepped back. Jimi was alone in the spotlight, the white Stratocaster gleaming against his fringed jacket. He played a few searching notes, dissonant and jagged. And then, out of the chaos, a melody emerged. A melody that every person in that field knew in their bones. Oh, say can you see? The Star-Spangled Banner. The American national anthem. But this was not the anthem played by marching bands at 4th of July parades. This was 1969. America was a country tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War was raging. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated the previous year. The cities were burning. The youth were being drafted to die in a jungle for a cause they didn't understand. Jimi didn't sing a word. He didn't have to. He let the guitar tell the truth. He played the first few bars relatively straight, the melody clear and proud. But as he reached, and the rocket's red glare, the world broke open. Using the tremolo bar, the whammy bar, Jimi dove the pitch down into the sub-bass frequencies. It sounded like a B-52 bomber dropping its payload. He scratched the strings, creating the sound of machine gun fire. He bent the notes until they screamed like falling jets. Crash. Boom. Wail. He was simulating an airstrike. In the middle of a peace festival, on a dairy farm in New York, Jimi Hendrix recreated the sound of napalm hitting a village in Vietnam. It was terrifying. It was ugly. It was a sonic painting of the violence that underpinned the American dream. The audience stood frozen. There was no cheering. You don't cheer for an airstrike. They stood with their mouths open, stunned by the sheer visceral power of the narrative. Jimi was channeling the collective trauma of a generation through 6 steel strings and a few vacuum tubes. He took the symbol of the establishment, the anthem, and twisted it into a mirror, forcing the country to look at its own reflection. But he didn't leave them in the war zone. Just as the sonic violence reached its peak, the bombs bursting in air, he resolved the chaos. Out of the smoke and the noise, he brought the melody back. Gave proof through the night, that our flag was still there. He played these lines with a delicate, tender beauty. It was a statement of survival. Despite the war, despite the riots, despite the mud and the drugs and the death, something still stood. The flag was tattered, burned, and stained, but it was still there. It was a complex patriotism, a love for the country that accepted its darkness. As the last note of the anthem faded into a sustain that seemed to last for eternity, the crowd didn't erupt. They were in shock. They had just been taken on a journey to the heart of darkness and brought back alive. Jimi Hendrix had not just played a song, he had performed an exorcism. After the apocalyptic fury of the Star-Spangled Banner, most musicians would have stopped. How do you follow the sound of bombs dropping? But Jimi wasn't done. He segued immediately into Purple Haze, giving the crowd a brief taste of the familiar, before dissolving the structure once again into pure, unadulterated creation. This is the moment, mentioned in the archives as the Woodstock improvisation, where the true genius of Hendrix reveals itself. He began to play a series of rapid, fluid arpeggios that sounded like classical music composed on Mars. He stripped away the fuzz, the distortion, and the aggression. The tone became clean, bell-like, and achingly sad. He was playing alone now. The band had effectively stopped, realizing they were witnessing something sacred. Jimi was exploring the fretboard, finding melodies that had never existed before and would never exist again. It was a stream of consciousness, a musical prayer offered to the morning sun. For the audience, this was the moment of shock you described. They had expected the wild man. They had expected fire. Instead, they got a fragile, vulnerable poet. He was showing them the other side of the coin. After the war, anthem, comes the morning. From this improvisation, he drifted seamlessly into a slow, haunting blues progression known as Villanova Junction. It was an instrumental piece, never recorded on a studio album, a melody he had kept in his back pocket for years. It is, perhaps, the most beautiful thing he ever played. The song is a funeral dirge. It is slow, mournful, and incredibly spacious. Jimi left gaps between the notes, letting the silence speak as loudly as the sound. He played with a delicacy that defied the massive wall of amplifiers behind him. The univibe pedal made the notes shimmer like tears. It sounded like he was saying goodbye. Goodbye to the festival, goodbye to the 60s, goodbye to the innocence that had brought 500,000 people to a farm in New York. The crowd, which had been cheering and dancing during Purple Haze, went completely silent. They stood in the mud, swaying gently, mesmerized by the sadness of the music. It was a collective realization that the party was over. The utopia they had tried to build for 3 days was dissolving, and the real world was waiting to reclaim them. Jimi was playing their exit music. Finally, after nearly 2 hours on stage, Jimi stepped to the microphone. He looked exhausted. His voice was a rasp. "We'd like to do one more song," he said, almost whispering. "I think you might know this one." He launched into "Hey Joe," the song that had started it all. But this version was different. It wasn't the angry, punchy radio hit. It was faster, looser, almost frantic. It was the sound of a man running out of time. He played it with a desperate energy, as if trying to outrun the inevitable. And then, it was over. There was no smashing of the guitar. No fire. No theatrics. Jimi simply unplugged his white Stratocaster, the cable making a loud pop as it left the jack. He held the guitar by the neck, turned his back on the crowd, and collapsed into the arms of his roadies. He had given everything. He was empty. As Jimi was helped off the stage, Chip Monk's voice came over the PA system one last time, "Ladies and gentlemen. Jimi Hendrix." The applause was thunderous, but it was distant. The 40,000 survivors began the long, slow trudge back to their cars, back to their jobs, back to Nixon's America. The field was left to the seagulls and the garbage. That performance changed everything. It proved that rock music could be more than just entertainment, it could be high art. It could be political commentary. It could be a spiritual experience. Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock didn't just play a concert, he drew a line in the sand. On one side was the 1960s, with its naive hope. On the other side was the 1970s, with its complexity, its darkness, and its heavy reality. If you want to understand the 70s, you don't need a history book. You just need to watch the footage of Jimi playing that improvisation. You need to see the look in his eyes, focused, sad, and infinitely wise. He knew what was coming. He knew that the dream was ending, and he played it a lullaby. 50 years later, the mud has dried, and the farm is green again. But the echo of that morning still rings. Every time a guitarist steps on a fuzz pedal, every time someone uses feedback as an instrument, every time music is used to speak truth to power, they are standing in the shadow of that white Stratocaster. Jimi Hendrix lived for another year after Woodstock, but in many ways, that Monday morning was his mountaintop. He had climbed higher than anyone else, looked over the edge, and reported back what he saw. And what he saw was beautiful, terrifying, and loud. The amplifiers have finally cooled down, and the mud at Max Yaska's farm has long since dried. But the question remains, was this the greatest musical performance of the 20th century, or was it a funeral march for the 1960s? I want to hear your thoughts. Were you one of the lucky ones who saw it? Do you remember the sound of that anthem? Leave a comment below, I read every single one of them. And if this story took you back to that Monday morning, please like this video and share it with a friend who understands that real music isn't just heard, it's felt. Until next time, keep the feedback ringing. I'll see you in the next chapter.